Yeah, so I'm Sean. I'm co-founder and board director at Circle, and excited to talk about this topic and introduce these experts who are doing amazing things in this space. I'd say, just for a couple of brief framing sentences, I think a lot of us here recognize the power of DeFi and the opportunity of a more inclusive global financial system, but traditional institutions have not come in for several reasons, but one of those reasons is that it's very tricky to verify the identities of counterparties. And one of the things that I think is particularly helpful about DeFi is that it's a really crisp, valuable use case for kind of getting identity right. When I worked on my first standards orgs and building out the early era of the web, we just got identity wrong. We built standards for delivering documents, but we didn't really do anything with identity. And that kind of led us to an internet where a handful of big tech de facto identity providers ended up in control of our identities and productizing our identities, and that way just obviously won't work for DeFi. Won't work for institutions, won't work for regulators, won't work for users or protocols. And so I'm really excited to moderate this discussion with three leaders in this space who are putting the right approach in place. So first, I'll introduce Daniel Buckner to the stage. Daniel leads decentralized identity for Block. He represents Block and the Decentralized Identity Foundation and is working with members of the DIF and W3C to make decentralized identity a reality. That's impressive. Thank you. Welcome to the stage. Also want to welcome Kim Hamilton Duffy. Kim is the... You're a celebrity here. Kim is Director of Identity and Standards at the Centre Consortium, where she leads Verite, a decentralized identity standard and open source toolkit for crypto finance. And then lastly, joining us remotely, I want to welcome Johan Bornman. Do we have Johan? There you are. Johan is the global product lead for MetaMask Institutional since launching the product in February of 2021. Johan has managed the product strategy and roadmap, design and operations, and also crypto custodian integrations. Welcome, Johan.
Thank you, Clyde.
All right, so just to kick this off, maybe we talk first about what the problem is that we're trying to solve in the space. Kim, I'll sort of start with you. How would you frame the problem that we are aiming to solve with decentralized identity in this particular DeFi space?
Yes, in DeFi, just checking you can hear me. So when you think about traditional financial institutions and risks in participating with DeFi, so I think one of their main priorities is risk management, risk mitigation, of course. With DeFi, there's a lot of ambiguity, a lot of lack of clarity on the regulatory side. So the question comes to how do you de-risk in this uncertainty? Then on the DeFi side, you end up with a situation where, yes, there's interest in bringing in institutional investment, but the problem there is twofold. One, of course, is the cost. So the cost of implementing traditional identity verification. And then in risks, frankly, with the way that identity verification is done right now, it involves individuals sharing, a whole lot of their personal identity information, and people don't necessarily want to have that. And then I think more importantly, though, is a fundamental mismatch. The principles of self-custody, privacy, interoperability. So basically, how do we navigate that? And lastly, I think what's especially pressing is the idea of the transparency enabled by on-chain interactions combined with traditional identity solutions is a risk.
Yeah, I think that what we kind of want to solve is, for the user anyways, we probably wouldn't want to bind all of these activities to traditional centralized identity systems, because then what really have you done, right? You could have privacy preserving transfers of cryptocurrency, for instance, but if you wrap it all in a centralized identity system, it's just traceable and it has all the downsides. And for institutions that are regulated, like Block is a regulated company. The reality on the ground is we don't have peer-to-peer decentralized identity reputational proofs and things you would need to do these transfers. So people are largely still interfacing with intermediaries, and those intermediaries, they're bound by law, so they have to check certain things. And without a native mechanism for doing it that's standard across the ecosystem, I think it really is holding a lot back, because everyone's just scurrying to do it in one-off ways. And I think that's really the challenge in front of us, is to have just the same common substrate we have for exchanging value that these crypto systems are bringing, things like Bitcoin, we need on the identity side for reputation proofs as well.
Johan, when it comes to the problem space, what do you, how would you sort of frame the problem for institutions who also have to deal with multiple jurisdictions and sort of geo-specific jurisdictions and compliance, and so, what's the element of that problem related to identity that you are seeing as you're looking at MetaMask institutional?
It's a really good question. I think that we've seen obviously this explosion within DeFi happened since the summer of 2020. And with that, obviously, a large institutional adoption within the ecosystem. And I think what you've seen propagate as well is sort of these KYC pools that I think have sparked interest from more traditional players that are more regulated. And I think the problem that we sort of see is that a lot of these pools and a lot of the user experiences and journeys into these pools aren't scalable, they're unportable. And so you have an institution having to really go through AML and KYC through every single layer of the stack. And obviously there's a reason for that. KYC by its very nature is not very portable. And I think what we see in the market today, there's a huge opportunity for decentralized identity to provide a more scalable solution towards on-chain access to DeFi, particularly for more regulated capital. We have a lot of conversations with institutions that are very much sitting on the sideline, trying to solve for all the problems that DeFi naturally, provides. So there's this, incredible opportunity in terms of yield, incredible opportunity in terms of taking risk, but with that, obviously, the idea of managing risk. And I think a lot of these problems have been solved around thinking about, custody, thinking about decoding transaction parameters, risk management in DeFi more broadly. And I think reputation, as the other panelists mentioned, I think is one of the key facets that can unlock more capital and more institutions in this space. So I think it's very much about thinking about how can we scale a lot of these KYC pools that we've seen within DeFi more broadly.
That's great. Maybe we move a little into the solution space. So maybe just broad strokes first, and then want to drill into the Verite framework as well more specifically, but starting with the broad stroke, what does a solution look like? Maybe start with you, Daniel. How is Block and how are you thinking about the solution for this next phase of the internet?
Yeah, so I mean, this is, wow, that was loud. So this is something you may have seen. We have this cheeky term that we kind of published, Web 5, that we believe in. It's not a joke. I mean, we do think that it's a little bit of a departure, maybe an evolution of what Web 3 is thought of, in the sense that we think that the underpinning pillars of decentralized identifiers, verifiable credentials for doing those proofs and reputational assertions, and then controlling user data and how it's exchanged are really the fundamentals that we have to get right. So we're really focused on building out open source versions of every one of those pillars, and some are already there. I mean, Kim knows this. She's worked in this space a long, long time. We have the advantage of being able to sort of take a lot of things that existed, a lot of things that have been standardized, and are now kind of trying to build that last mile. Like, what does the consumer experience look like? What does returning data ownership look like? And those three elements have to be there to sort of apply it to the causes of these DeFi causes or decentralized apps. So that's what I do at Block, is work on that substrate, and I think it's broadly useful regardless of whatever your decentralized use case is.
Yeah. Kim?
Yeah, so I think that maybe we should define decentralized identity soon, but the crypto space DeFi is these risks and challenges that we discussed. Decentralized identity is the ideal solution for that. It solves the problems of getting identity information from individuals, but on their terms. It empowers people to reuse credentials, take them around with them, enables privacy and basically lets institutions perform the checks that they need, but without introducing the same legacy problems with identity management.
Yeah, maybe actually drilling down a little bit into decentralization. Like, what does it actually mean for identity to be decentralized?
Yeah.
And then what's the value to people of having some elements of identity decentralized? And
yeah, one, it's a terrible name. We need a better name, and that's something we've been struggling with for a while. But decentralized identity, the reason it's named that way is the progression from centralized to federated to decentralized. So centralized is in the early days of the web, where you have a login password with every service provider you interact with. Now we're in the federated identity phase, where you're familiar with single sign-on, log in with Facebook or something like that. And so the single sign-on, in contrast to centralized, so that was solving two problems. One is a lot of institutions, service providers, they don't want to deal with all of this identity data. Dealing with authentication is hard, so why not rely on someone else to do it? Now for us, the consumers, we got some convenience out of it, but there's still a lot of risk with it, a lot of tracking that could be done. And I think most importantly is in centralized and federated, we individuals don't participate as peers, and that's really what decentralized identity is trying to do. So you don't just authenticate to a service provider. They may also authenticate to you or other individuals you interact with. And so it really shifts kind of the power, really, and you get to take your identity data, credentials, et cetera, with you and interact on your terms, know who's getting your data, and interact more confidently.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most crisp way to think about what decentralized identity would do for you is, just take application use cases that everyone interacts with. Like, Twitter is a really good example. And certainly in authoritarian regimes this is the case for digital identity, but people are canceled, they have their digital identities removed. I don't think that it's malicious. I think that it's sort of an outgrowth of the fact that we had a centralized identity system in place, and so it makes logical sense as a business when you're saying something like, well, I don't want to do business with you anymore, so I'll block you. Now I think that that is sort of naive in the early internet, because that seemed like a logical course, but now now that we're tying so much more important information to our digital identifiers, in this case, maybe you log in with Twitter or log in with Facebook, it's not just pictures of cats anymore that you're losing when they delete it, right? If we were to base all of the new digital identity stuff on these old centralized identifiers, it means when a business makes a decision to sever a relationship with you, really, they're severing your digital self. And so we need to really separate the two. It's like the separation of church and state, right? We really need identity to be separated from app services and financial transactions, so that everyone is really in ownership of these things and can choose who they can interact with, but you don't have those reverberating consequences from simply walking away from the table from someone.
I think one way to make it really concrete is, instead of calling it decentralized identity, if you think about it as self-managed or self-custodied identity, you can think about it a lot as your crypto wallet. So you just, you take your wallet around, you connect your wallet, but that's all anyone needs to know about you. You don't necessarily need to create an account. And so similarly with decentralized identity or self-custodied identity, the goal is to build a much richer experience that kind of simulates that. Not to say that's necessarily a be-all, end-all, but that you can disclose what's needed for parties that you interact with just by the data that you're already custodying.
Yeah. Johan, before we get into more of the nuts and bolts with how this stuff works, and I have some questions too to help you guys can help us sort through some confusion as well as we get into that. But first, kind of stick to the business case of this. Why would a DeFi protocol want to integrate decentralized identity? Like, how does that bring institutions in? What's the kind of business case for helping facilitate this in DeFi?
Yeah, I think there's a sort of simple solution, and then I think there's a more profound medium to longer term solution. I think of this sort of short term and simple solution paints the fact that what you're solving for is a not just a better user experience, but very importantly, reducing some of the cost infrastructure of conducting KYC at every single layer of the stack. More profoundly, though, I think everyone in this room no doubt agrees that DeFi just offers fundamentally better capital markets. You have the opportunity for better price discovery, you have transparency, you have near instant settlement, you have interoperability. And I think a big piece that's missing around this is, as we talked about previously, is reputation, because what that unlocks is obviously a very important use case around more efficient capital markets. I think the previous panel spoke very eloquently about this idea that today on chain, there's no real risk infrastructure. And so we talk about banking the unbanked, but we're not quite there yet. And I think decentralized identity really opens up that use case around reputation. And what that paints to, and with all the conversations we're having with custodians and traditional financial players, is about credit brokering, leverage. How can we have a lot of these things that Kim is talking about play out in capital markets to make it far more efficient? And therefore, you are, again, bridging more organizations into DeFi more broadly. Obviously, that's deeply, deeply profound.
Yeah. Okay. So specifically, let's sort of shift to talking about how this stuff actually works. How it works sort of at the protocol level, but also what people do. Maybe this is a good opportunity to dig into the Verite framework. I guess, first of all, what is the Verite framework, and how would you describe it?
Right, Verite is a collection of, or curation is how I think about it, standards and protocols, open source implementation around how you can use decentralized identity very practically in decentralized finance. So, we've both been in decentralized identity for a while. I think one of the things that appealed to me, and Sean recruited me to Center, was the idea that there were some really crisp use cases in decentralized finance. So, in decentralized identity, sort of more historically, I think the way that people tend to think about it is, oh, let's just issue you a credential and let's put everything in it, and then maybe you can go use that somewhere. Whereas with Verite, what we really did was line up an ecosystem first approach. So make sure to get all the participants in the ecosystem to find these are exactly the kinds of credentials or claims that we want people to use. So those might be accredited investor and things like that. So what we did then is, because it's so tricky to navigate the decentralized identity standard space and sort of figure out how to get started, we just picked kind of the simple, straightforward ones, also with open source implementations. We wanted to avoid lock-in into certain vendors and also lock into certain blockchain. So yeah, what we did there then was we don't think of it as a new standard. We think of it as a curation, and we work, most of the underlying standards are like around exchange between credentials, individuals, and how they hold them in their wallet, how they get it from issuers, how they exchange them. We're still working on those with standards organizations. So, but yeah, really what we're trying to do with it is provide a way for people to get started and really get the sort of full ecosystem lined up.
Yeah. So just on the topic of standards, Daniel, Block does seem to be one of those companies that had Block desired, could have gone the more centralized gatekeeper way and the sort of big tech, I don't want to name names, but the obvious big tech way, and really you've embraced the idea of standards in this identity space, but in general. What's the importance of interoperable standards?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, proprietary decentralized identity is sort of an oxymoron. Impossible, really, to work. So I think that, from the highest levels of Block and certainly in the leadership in TBD, they understood right off the bat that we can't make a decentralized value transfer protocol like TBDEX and come up with our own identity system, because then we have to convince the world to use it. And it's much easier to use the standards that folks like Kim and myself, participating with many others over the years, have put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into to make sure that those tools are available. And so it just made sense to use something that everyone can circle the wagons around. And to highlight, Verite is a lot of the component parts we have in common. And I would imagine that there's going to be a point coming not too far off where we're aligned and those protocols snap one-to-one to each other. So really what we're talking about is different documentation, presentation, curation, the outer layers are the difference, but the inner layers, there's interoperability. And how else would we interop with large companies like the one you represent and others, if not by all kind of snapping to the same thing?
And I think one angle to that too is just given that decentralized identity standards and protocols are so new, I think that the advantage with these sort of curated cookbook kind of approaches is just really showing people what's possible. We want to guide people in a good direction because in some cases, say decentralized identity, verifiable credentials and all of these, you can use more advanced features like zero knowledge proofs. At the same time, all of these different parts are at different levels of maturity. And so what we don't want is to say, okay, here are all your identity credentials, go wild, right? You want to provide some kind of guarantees, protection, and so a lot of what we're doing when we do this is say, okay, here's a credential that we're confident that it has a safe amount of information in there. So there's a lot of these kind of best practices around personal data management, not putting all of your raw data into a claim, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's where we're at as an ecosystem too, right? Like initially, probably until about a year ago, we were still at the let's build the constituent parts, and there were so many of them out there, so many choices. And we had other organizations that 5 years ago tried to do the stack thing, as we know, and I think that was just way too early. I feel like now we have all the constituent parts. There's not a whole lot of unknowns left in terms of those components, and it really is a task of bringing it to mass market in more curated fashion, so people can say, look, don't just mix and match. You're going to end up with this combinatoric problem of everyone's just a little bit off, right, and can't speak to each other. You might as well have implemented nothing the same at that point. So it's really important that things like Verite and other frameworks that choose the same set of standards, not just doing it standard, but choosing the same set, so that you don't have this Tower of Babel condition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the history of the internet seems to be littered with the carcasses of dead identity companies that try to get everyone to adopt their way. And having something we can say, hey, this is how Block is doing it. This is how Center is doing it. Coinbase, Circle, Consensus. This is how we're doing it. So if you adopt this protocol, which none of us own, if you adopt this protocol, our stuff's going to work with your stuff, and that's much more important than trying to own some of these individual constituent connection points. Super valuable. Johan, how do you think about integrating something like these standards into MetaMask institutional? How do you sort of approach, what is your block that you want to connect to the other block and to others who are building in this space?
Yeah, I think the wallet can play a really fundamental role in sort of the access and connectivity layer to all of Web3. And that's really sort of how we think about MetaMask institutional more broadly. And I think with that access and connectivity layer, I think DIDs and VCs can play an incredibly powerful role in terms of, again, protecting the identity, protecting pseudonymity and privacy, but also then providing access at the same time. And I think today, if you just look across the ecosystem, there's so many instances where an organization or even individuals has to go through KYC or a form of sort of compliance, essentially. And then with that, there's also the aspect of having to prove that compliance or testing to compliance. So I think there's such a natural converge and sort of a natural congruency and role that the wallet can play, sort of holding these DIDs. And I think it very much sort of, if we think about the physical world and how we carry our wallets around, and within that physical wallet, we all have, ID cards or library cards, very similar cards that make different claims or attestations that give us access, to the physical world. And I think if we think of Web3 being the new internet, and the creation of value, the storing of value, the transfer of value, communication, all these layers will live on chain eventually. I think identity plays a fundamental role, and I think the wallet with that is obviously, I think, very, very important, paramount. So the work we've done over the last several months is just thinking very deeply of what is that user experience? How might a verified credential be created and generated? How is it securely uploaded into the wallet? And what is the user experience for an organization with multiple different users in selecting which verified credentials to use when accessing DeFi in different manners?
Mm-hmm. I think we're getting into some terms we should probably clarify, because one of the things that I think maybe you guys can help us with is there's DIDs, decentralized identifiers, there's VCs, verifiable credentials, there's a bunch of other acronyms. We now have, Vitalik was talking this morning, passing about soulbound tokens. We have blockchain domain names, which have social tokens and reputational things attached to them. We have all this stuff. What are the right technologies we should be looking at when we're talking about an actual solution that makes sense? And then just, frankly, what do you think is outright wrong? What's the wrong direction on this? Okay, this is for anyone who wants to jump in.
Soulbound tokens. Yeah, that's, I think there are wrong directions. That may be one of them. The idea that the majority of your proofs, which don't even need to be constructed as tokens, would live on a transparent and public blockchain tied to fundamentally, generally, a single account in most account-based models for some of these chains, I think it flirts with dystopia, to be quite honest with you. I don't think that the vast majority of credential interactions in the world will go through a blockchain. I mean, I think you might have a membership at a health club, and that's going to get issued as a verifiable credential. There's no reason it needs a token representation, right? And even some of the ways that I've seen tokens used, just don't make a whole lot of sense when applied to real life. Things like tickets. It's a really interesting, you think of tickets as being like, oh, it's I want this unfettered secondary market of trading, when really, a lot of ticket sellers don't want that. They might still want to be involved in saying, this is my venue, which is ultimately centralized. Decentralized tickets, and you show up and they just won't let you in. You're like, but it's decentralized. Turns out they own the venue. So I think these things don't make a whole lot of sense in ways. And then when it comes to things where you actually want identity in the chain, underutilized is like, does it need to be present as a token, or could it be fed in as like contract arguments or any other means that aren't like having you carry this vestigial thing around where people can kind of observe and inspect, aside from all the other weird things about people dropping tokens in your wallet you don't want and all that nonsense. So yeah, I would really pump the brakes on soulbound tokens specifically, and just tokens in general. I think there's probably a place for certain things, but identity doesn't have to be articulated that way.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on it, so I'm going to try to cut it down. I think, though, one thing that happened with soulbound tokens, and if you are on Twitter, you probably noticed all the activity, and it was, I think, a real missed opportunity, because there was suddenly a lot of attention on on-chain use cases for identity data, which is something that many people have been thinking about for a while, and kind of figuring it, like navigating what parts should be on-chain and what should be off-chain, and there are many factors in it. So one might be that, okay, blockchain gives you the sort of tamper evidence properties and maybe timestamping properties, but a combination of like GDPR regulatory frameworks, with right to erasure, that might be a consideration for wanting to put data on chain. But then more importantly, so you could approach it from the lens of, okay, this is my data, it's my public data. Say it's equivalent to LinkedIn. Like, say I am fine with everyone knowing this bit of information about me. The problem is you can't really change your mind. So not just the idea that it's locked into a chain, but it's there forever. So some of the use cases that I got from it were actually from Vitalik himself in a podcast with Evan. And so the use case was a sort of proof of reputation based on the fact that you have not been arrested, or it was something along those lines, which was basically that one specifically overlooked a lot of imbalances, injustices, and sort of like how some people are discriminated against and how that might be a bad signal to use. But just the idea that all these signals, once they're on chain, they can get used and recombined in interesting ways so that people learn a lot more about you than you're comfortable with. And so, the way we think about in Verite is not so much like soulbound tokens bad. I think we're interested in discussion there about what's the right amount of data that can be on chain. So why do you want any personal data on chain. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the rails that we need around decentralized identity are just not there. So do you use an oracle? Do you, so like there's not necessarily an obvious solution. So people are trying to solve real problems with it. So the way that I'm hoping that we approach it going forward, which we're trying to do with Verite community groups, is really try to establish guidance about what's a good amount of data to be on chain. So, maybe say if it's a KYC credential, but not also like maybe level of granularity is something like the country, but not necessarily the state you live in and all these other factors. And there are a lot of complex criteria in it, like differential privacy frameworks in terms of how much it takes to uniquely identify a person in a pool. So it's a really long, nuanced conversation that I hope we keep going and not sort of have further division in the communities.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about what the ideal flow might look like. This is not a product announcement, but if I'm a financial institution, and I want to come in to participate in DeFi, and imagine that all of us crypto people want that to happen because it increases the liquidity that's available in these DeFi pools. So I have MetaMask Institutional as part of my treasury flows internally. What am I doing? Maybe we'll start with Johan, with you. What am I doing to participate in this? And then want to walk through what does the protocol provider, so the the Solidity contracts or other implementations, what are they requiring, and what does that kind of loosely look like? Just to get a sense for how this might work. Maybe start with you, Johan.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that most individuals and most organizations go through KYC at some stage of engaging on chain. We all use a fiat on-ramp. Institutions engage with custodians. And through that process of going through KYB, in the case of an organization, a verifiable credential can be generated that can then be securely injected into a wallet. And obviously, to Kim's point, it's very important to be really thoughtful about the schema or the properties within that verified credential, what claims essentially are being made. Nonetheless, that VC can live in the wallet, and that means the organization can then transact within DeFi. And as they connect to a DeFi protocol, there might be a process of verification that happens. And again, you can have a very thoughtful conversation around how does verification happen. But sort of a very simple mental model or metaphor is turning up at a party and sort of proving or using a badge that you're allowed to have access to the party. And so an organization that previously was very worried about counterparty risk or DeFi more broadly can essentially participate in a pool now where all the entities within that pool have gone through KYC and also can attest the same claims essentially.
So what's actually flowing across the wire, Daniel or Kim? What's sort of flowing across the wire? I have proof now that I have been KYC, or I'm a business, sorry, I forgot. I have been KYB'd, but I have proof now in the form of a credential. How does a protocol request that, or what does the exchange kind of loosely look like?
Yeah, I can start with this. And so I think that the credential exchange protocols is like, at least from the data model and other aspects of the protocol, that's something that we're actually working very closely on. The main thing there is, say if the protocol wants to get a verifiable credential, they want to get some information about you, and I won't even jump to verifiable credentials. So they want some characteristics of you. So there are protocols and data models that let the DeFi protocol say, okay, this is the information I need from you, and it might be something about like you've been KYC'd, or it might have, they might actually want to rule out that you live in the state of New York or something like that as well. So these protocols that we're talking about allow the wallet to inspect your contents and combine all of these credentials in a payload that is called, it's a verifiable presentation, which is sort of like a slice and dice of verifiable credentials that you're custodying, and then that goes over to to the DeFi protocol who requested. Now, one of the things that we noticed when we started Verite, we sort of designed around the assumption that the wallet that's talked about would be a decentralized identity wallet. And we didn't restrict it to say like your crypto wallet must also be a decentralized identity wallet, like they could be two separate ones. But we were thinking about a sort of rich decentralized identity wallet. And by that I mean, it knows what decentralized identifiers are. It knows about all these identity protocols that I was talking about. What we're doing, what we've done over time, and we've been updating our guidance around it, is sort of what could it look like for other wallets so that it's an easier lift. So basically having the equivalent of an agent that you might sign in with Ethereum or something like that. And it can perform these, it can do all that heavy lifting for you. So the wallet can still just custody the credentials, but it doesn't have to do all this difficult integration work. So what we're really doing is trying to, based on feedback from the community ecosystem, try to figure out what are the right, where things should belong, what are some better architecture diagrams.
Yeah, I mean, so I can talk about the experience we have. We have a wallet we're working on initially as a web extension, and we'll have, mobile apps as well, all open source, something you could stick your own label on. The extension is pretty straightforward. Like, to do a credential issuance, you might go to a website and you click on a button that activates the extension. And what the issuer is presenting to you is, here's my requirements. Here's what I need to ingest to be, sure or gain some understanding of the thing I want to issue you in response. And so the wallet will procure that information, let you obviously, agree to send it. And if you do, the issuer noodles over it. It's basically sent to their, what we call DWeb nodes. And they're able to make sense of it and process it, do any sort of backend logic they need, and then communicate it back so that it gets put in your wallet and you can use it in their flow or any other flow going forward. Presentation is very similar. Presentation is kind of a subset of issuance in the sense that if someone says, hey, I'm gating this flow you're about to engage in based on this proof, they're going to give you something that your wallet's going to take and kind of sort through all the credentials in your wallet very quickly. Maybe you have, like, let's say over the fullness of time, you have 50 of them. It's essentially a little language, and this is, Kim and I worked on this, to be able to isolate just the ones that'll work, right? The ones that'll get you through the door, and then present you and say, hey, which one, right? If there's multiple, and you would then select as a user. So these are all the component pieces of things like Verite that we've been working on for a long time. And I'm hopeful that other wallets pick them up. I'm hopeful that some of these standards maybe appear in MetaMask one day. Who knows, right? That'd be great.
There is one thing that you mentioned I'm not sure we really got into. So decentralized identifiers and what we mean by that. So, in this sort of newer combinations of flows that how do you say, like non-decentralized identity wallets can participate in, there are ways to also allow them to use decentralized identifiers even though they're not aware of it. So to be very precise, say you have an Ethereum wallet and you have your Ethereum account address. So what could happen in these flows is like the issuer can say they can generate what your DID must look like, and they can issue you a credential that has a decentralized identifier, and you can still participate. So even though your wallet didn't know about the centralized identity, you can still participate and kind of up level into all these flows. But I guess I should define a centralized identifier. So one way that we describe it is sort of like, say you have your social security number. It's just this very weak kind of string that people can pass around and attach claims about you, but there's no ability to sort of prove that that's your social security number. We use a lot of services and signals to do that, but in contrast, a decentralized identifier is a string. It's a URI, so it's like a web address, right? So it says did : blah, 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 but it has all these properties around it, and so one of those would be you can authenticate with it or prove that that's actually yours. So another one that is really the reason that I got into decentralized identifiers is the idea that it deals with cryptographic key rotation in a more first-class way, right? So say if you get a credential that's bound to your address, if you lose the ability to control that address, then that credential goes away. So what we like about decentralized identifiers is there's all kinds of ways to rotate that key material, whether it's on-chain or just through like M of N kind of, having people vouch for you or something like that. So these strings, once you use them in the context of credentials, both as the recipient and the issuer, give you a lot of advantages. And basically that's sort of being able to up-level into, in a sort of identity context, higher levels of assurance, just because these are much stronger. You can prove it's about you.
Yeah, I mean,
Very thoughtful. Yeah.
DIDs, how I like to describe it is they're actually a more primitive user of what Satoshi pioneered with Bitcoin, in the sense that you'd think to yourself, well, why didn't we just have decentralized identifiers? And it's actually sort of a 30-year pursuit to try and find a system by which you could have an identifier. Just think about it as sort of like a very ugly Twitter @handle linked to some keys, and be able to rotate those keys over time. Right now we have the CA system from DNS, and it's very centralized, and we have things like PGP, which are rather weak and have a lot of bottleneck points. And we have no way to sort of associate an ID with multiple keys that could be rotated over time, where you could know the current state of this ID, right? Like if I had a previous phone and I want to disassociate my previous phone and associate my new one, there's not really a system that existed. So really what Satoshi did, money's a construct on top of Bitcoin, but really what he did is he created a sequencing oracle. And that was actually at the heart of the DID problem, is we had no concept of what came before when in a deterministic way. So most of the DID systems are very simple in the sense that they end up rooting proof of like, this was my state of my ID and the keys associated at time X, and then at a later point in time Y, I changed it. And in simple terms, that didn't exist for 30, 40 years, and that's why the internet was born without verifiable IDs.
Good. So I know this was a 30-minute session, and we could probably go on for another, I could listen to you all talk for another 2 or 3 hours on this topic. There's a lot there. I think it's an incredibly important topic, and we sort of step back. Issues around regulatory policy, user experience are the big things that are holding USDC and the rest of crypto back from this next wave. And the key piece of that is how are we going to deal with identity? And that's with regard to institutions and DeFi, it's a great catalyst, but really it's much bigger than that. And it was just, it's a delight to hear you all elaborate on this topic. I want to thank you very much for participation in this panel. I want to thank everybody for attending.
Thank you.